Okay, before we get into this, I just want to preface this with I do really like cEDH as a casual competitive format. Don't take this as me saying cEDH in its entirety is bad. And it's great that we can have these games that don't require that rule zero conversation and all players come to the table on the same page, that we're all doing the things that will win us the game. That's the whole conceit of cEDH, and I think that's great. However, in a tournament setting, I, at this point in time, would not feel comfortable playing in a cEDH tournament with any kind of prize pool on the line, and these are the 3 reasons why. And I really don't even know how to solve the third one.
Distraction makers.
So the first big problem that cEDH is having is that a large percentage of games are ending in draws. When we go back and look at the 5 most recent tournaments that had over 100 players, they have an average draw rate of over 28%. And what that means is that you are more likely to draw a game than you are to win a game from any given seat at the table. In cEDH, a win is worth 5 points and a draw is worth 1 point. So there is some scale difference in that you do want to be pushing for a win because it's worth substantially more points than it might be in 1v1 where it's worth 3 points. But what that kind of means is that if you get a single win, you are fairly likely to end up in the top cut. If you get 2 wins, you're pretty much guaranteed. So what's the scenario that's leading to a draw in cEDH? One of the biggest problems with 4-player free-for-all games, especially ones with lots of interaction, is what's called kingmaking. And kingmaking means that you as a player may not be able to actually win the game, but you can end up in a situation where you can decide who will actually win the game. And the way that this ends up happening in a cEDH tournament is one player will attempt to win. They'll put their win on the stack, and then another player will attempt to win over the top of them, which is a pretty common practice in cEDH. Is the table sort of builds up to everybody having enough resources that everybody just kind of tries to win in one giant stack. And so you can end up in this situation where one player has a win attempt on the stack and another player has a win attempt on the stack, and you are sitting here with a counterspell in your hand. And you can say, hey, if you don't agree to a draw, then I'm going to let that player win. And if that player doesn't agree to a draw, then I'm going to let that player win. And that basically means that, well, I would rather get 1 point than 0 points, so I will agree to a draw. So the question then becomes, why? Why are draws worth 1 point? Why are they not worth 0 points? And unfortunately, we kind of end up in this situation where if a draw is worth 0 points, right, you then are deciding, okay, there's no incentive to draw for us all to have a mutually beneficial sort of non-zero sum outcome. And instead, you end up in this king-making situation that is arbitrary, where I'm going to decide which of these two players wins, and I don't really get anything for that. So that sort of can contribute to collusion, which we'll come back to later. Changing it so that draws are worth 0 points is not the silver bullet that fixes this problem, unfortunately. So you could then look at free counterspells as sort of this thing that you could attack with the ban list to try to prevent this from happening. But in that scenario, you're removing the things that are just stopping Turbo from winning, right? If you ban something like Force of Will, I think that's a pretty bad idea. However, I do think there's one counterspell that stands above the rest in this environment, and that is Pact of Negation, because Pact of Negation theoretically has a pretty steep cost if you were to play your next turn, because then you have to pay for Pact of Negation on your next turn or lose the game. But there's never a next turn, right? You basically play this. It's a tool that says, hey, I'm king-making right now, and agree to a draw, and then we all walk away with 1 point instead of one of us walking away with 5 and the others walking away with 0. So I could see the argument for banning Pact of Negation, which we've talked before about on this channel. The next issue that cEDH is currently experiencing is a huge disparity in win percentages based on which seat at the table you're sitting at. And when we look at the 5 most recent cEDH tournaments with over 100 players at time of recording, first place seat has nearly a 23% chance to win the game, and fourth seat has around an 11% chance to win the game on average. And the reason why none of these are at 25% is because of the draw rates. So like I said before, you are more likely to draw a game in cEDH than you are to win it from any given seat at the table, at least when we look at the recent cEDH data. So what ends up happening because of these table dynamics is that if a player is in fourth seat, they are heavily incentivized to play to kingmake, to make the game end in a draw, because they really don't have a particularly good chance of winning that game. And so this contributes to that kingmaking scenario that we're talking about in problem number 1 and causes a lot more games to draw. It would be interesting to have the data collection from before the I guess not all that recent, but the last sort of big commander bans when they banned Dockside, Jeweled Lotus, and Mana Crypt to see if those had a substantial impact on this particular problem. I think any of them could give sort of a substantial impact on this, but they also, most of them cut both ways, right? Where if you're in seat 1 and you get a Mana Crypt or a Jeweled Lotus, that boosts you ahead. But Dockside Extortionist actually works best when you're later in turn order because other players have sort of had these permanents that they've played to the board, and then you can get a bigger payoff because it's coming into play later with your opponent's turn permanents being in play. So one of the solutions I've heard for trying to fix this problem is that tournament organizers have been changing the number of points that you get for a win based on the seat position at the table. There's been some talk about how if you win from seat 4, it's worth more points than if you win from seat 1 because theoretically it's more difficult. The problem I have with that scenario is that you're actually not fixing the problem. You're just basically saying that, like, we know it's difficult to win from this seat, so if you do, it's worth much more. But you're not actually giving that player better odds of winning the game. So in my opinion, it would be better to make it so that at least player 1 doesn't draw a card on turn 1, maybe only player 4 draws a card on turn 1, and then also you could take a look at the free mulligan, which I think should not really be part of a competitive environment to begin with because it makes decks much too consistent. If any player should get a free mulligan, it is seat 4. And I think by making those changes, you're not assuming that seat 4 has to play certain cards in their deck. You're also not changing the sort of tournament structure so that it would need to be tweaked over time as these percentages changed. You're basically saying, hey, here's this rule that applies evenly to everyone. We could then remeasure over time to see how that's changed things. I realize that the challenge there, though, is that Wizards of the Coast is the entity that would need to make this decision. I don't think tournament organizers could really have control over those sort of system rules in that way, where they do have control over the tournament points and how those are allocated. I've also seen one solution that's kind of been tossed around as seat 4 should receive sort of a treasure at the beginning of the game. And I think it's been talked about as not actually a treasure, but more like an emblem so that there's no like artifact synergies and those kinds of things. And I really just think that that's probably overkill. You might end up in a situation where seat 4 is actually the most advantageous seat to be in because you can use that mana to sort of snowball your way into accumulated value over time. Basically, it would mean that seat 4 is the most likely seat to get Heuristic Study into play turn 1 every time that you play. And if games go long, these sort of seat win percentage end up kind of evening out in a way rather than continuing to be so dramatically disparate from each other. So seat 4 is incentivized to go long, which I think contributes to that sort of heuristic meta that we're seeing. And if you can get it into play early, you're more likely to get advantages from it, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's finally get to the big one, and this one I really have no idea how you would solve because it is unfortunately a core problem with the ability to politic in cEDH, and that is the problem of collusion. Okay, also before we get into this section, I just want to say I'm basically going to be explaining to you how you could be cheating at a cEDH tournament through collusion. You shouldn't be doing this, but you should be aware that this could be happening at a tournament that you're at. And as long as you are okay with entering that environment and realizing that the money that you have put on the line is not, if you're showing up to a tournament, a cEDH tournament by yourself without any friends to help you win that tournament, you are at a disadvantage. And collusion we have talked about before on this channel, but I wanted to actually go through the numbers as to how big of an impact this actually has in a tournament, because I think when we talk about collusion, there's sort of this nebulous, like, yeah, okay, it probably happens. How big of a deal is it? I don't know. It's probably just sort of out there in the shadows happening, and there's not really anything we can do about it. So first, let me define collusion, because I think there's also been a little bit of confusion as to what it is. Collusion is not players collaborating at the table during gameplay and politicking, making deals, working together in that environment. That's politicking, that's cooperating, that's not collusion. Collusion is when a number of players outside of the tournament decide ahead of time that they will all work together in the tournament to help each other win the tournament. And sometimes this can be as simple as, okay, well, we have a group of friends that all go to a cEDH tournament together, and you might inadvertently let somebody get away with something you wouldn't let somebody else get away with. So there's sort of a spectrum to how impactful collusion can be, all the way to the point of during gameplay, I am going to purposefully make what would otherwise be considered poor play choices to help benefit my fellow colluder. This could be things like feeding them cards with heuristic study, or even countering spells that somebody else had played to stop them from winning, but that's pretty obvious collusion. So I doubt, I think it would be pretty easy for the other players to make a case that say, hey, these two players are working together to push through a win. The question then is, how big of a deal actually is it? How many players do you need to show up with to a tournament to be able to have a substantial impact on the results of that tournament? So if you show up with 10% of the players that are playing in a cEDH tournament, that means if the tournament is 100 players and you show up with 10 that are all willing to collude together, in round one, you have about a 70% chance that two colluders will end up in a pod together. 70% of colluders ending up together, paired together in round one is pretty substantial. But as we look further into the tournament, players end up being split into different buckets, right? You have players that have won the round, you have players that have lost the round, and you have players that had a draw in the round. In round two, depending upon where the colluders ended up, they have either a less likely or a more likely way to end up in a pod together. So we'd end up with something like 20 winners with 3 colluders in that pool, which means you have a 36.8% chance for 2 of them to be paired up in a pod together in the winners bracket. 2 colluders would be in the draw bucket, which means that you would have a 12% chance, around a 12% chance for those colluders to be paired up together in the draw bracket. And 56 losers would include 5 colluders in that bracket with a 40% chance to be paired up against each other. So total, we have about a 66% chance in round 2 for the colluders to end up together in a pod. So if we were to remove draws, we would end up with 20 winners and 80 losers, and this would end up with a 70% chance for a pair of colluders to end up together. So that actually is kind of an argument for why you wouldn't want to get rid of draws, because the draws on average of 20% are removing some of those colluders into that draw bucket. But if you're paying attention, you're going to understand where I'm going with this, because there's a particular tactic that the colluders could use to end up in the same buckets together, while the people who drew the round end up in a separate bucket. So basically, what you would want to do if you were trying to collude in a cEDH tournament and ensure that somebody in your group gets at least one free win is during round 1, all colluders would want to play to win as much as possible. But if a draw is offered at any point, colluders are incentivized to say, no, I would like to not draw, and I will choose instead to lose the game. And what that means is that those players ensure that they end up in the losing bracket rather than some in the draw bucket and some in the lose and some in the win. So if instead all colluders were to lose in round 1, you would end up with an 88% chance for the colluders in the losers bracket to end up in the same pod. And if colluders were employing the strategy over the course of 2 rounds, you would end up with something like a 97% chance that at least 2 colluders end up in a pod together at some point. And if they can force one of those players to win, which is pretty likely when 2 players are working together and the other 2 players at the table don't know that they are, you can ensure that one of the players of the 10 colluders that you showed up to at the 100-person tournament would end up with a free win. So then the question is, how impactful is that free win on the outcome of the tournament? And when we look at what's going on with the current meta, we can see that 1 or 2 wins is roughly enough to get you into the top 16. So some players could end up with 50% of the thing that got them into the top 16 as being an illegitimate win. I don't think there's a particularly good way to solve this collusion problem, unfortunately. Poker has rules against this that are colluding is illegal. They make it so that you cannot discuss strategy or gameplay at the table, and this is why, because it's pretty easy for 2 players to collude and basically fleece the other players at the table. What that would mean in a cEDH environment is that politicking, talking to the other players, discussing strategy, anything like that would need to be outlawed at the tables. You wouldn't be able to do that. And I would assume that the majority of people trying to play cEDH are playing it because they enjoy the political aspects of the game. They enjoy that they are making deals and working angles against other players to try to get through to the win. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom here. I want to talk a little bit about things that game designers should think of when they're working on a free-for-all game to try to avoid some of these problems. One way to sort of alleviate the king-making scenario in a free-for-all game is to limit interaction. When we look at other games that have free-for-all type environments, we have things like swimming, where individual swimmers are separated into their own lanes, and we're basically just racing to see who can swim the fastest. Or we have something like Formula One or NASCAR, where cars are all racing together, but interaction is heavily disincentivized in these environments because, well, you could die, right? Not only does it mean that you're taking you and your fellow driver out of the race, but also there's a substantial risk to your own life to interact. That's not to say that that's like the only way that can be racing can be interacted with. There's different lines and things and ways for you to position yourself to make sure that your fellow racers aren't on the line that they want to be on, those types of things, the more subtle interaction points with car racing. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that those things are like interaction is still quite limited in that environment. The next problem would be the sort of seat disparity win problem. And I think Magic suffers from this more so than other games that would have a different mode of sort of interaction at the table, where Magic has a very large interaction gap, right? Where one player gets to take a whole lot of actions, technically unlimited actions until they sort of pass the turn, right? When they run out of resources, then they pass the turn to the next player. So players can sort of get very far out ahead of other players before other players get to take any actions to sort of impact the game. So if instead Magic was a game where you took a single action and then another player took a single action and a single action and a single action, as sort of a single action interaction gap system, you would theoretically make it so that players can have less of players would have an opportunity to respond to what another player is doing before they've gotten too far out ahead. And I think this would lessen the swinginess, right? The ability for one player to sort of explode and win the game. And the last thing with collusion, I really think that the only way you're going to be able to address this issue, if you wanted to keep politics in the game, is to incentivize players to announce that they are working together. And you would do that through the game systems, right? You would have kind of something like an alliance system where two players can team up and they get a mechanical benefit for telling the other two players at the table that they are working together. And then colluders would sort of have an incentive to say, hey, we are working together. Other two players, you should probably also work together to try to defeat us, because if you don't, it will be a 2v1v1, basically. A lot of these problems are eliminated in a 1v1 environment. There is still some of this present, but the impact two players can have on a game while working together, you can't work together in a single game of Magic to try to defeat another opponent, right? So playing 1v1 competitively would be one solution. But I get that cEDH players like the play style of cEDH. They like the politicking. They like the 4-player dynamics. And so just saying, hey, play 1v1, not really helpful. So I think the other solution here is also not sort of equally not as helpful, which is that these events for cEDH could be handled in a different way. So it's not really about extreme competitiveness the same way that 1v1 is. I think a lot of the excitement about cEDH is kind of a turning over of the competitive metas, I guess, for Magic, in that there's a new crop of players that sort of feel like they get to put their stamp on competitive Magic. But I do worry that these problems are going to make it quite difficult for cEDH to be a fair tournament environment, unfortunately. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. There's something I'm missing here. There are other ways to solve these problems that I didn't present here. I think it would be very beneficial for the cEDH tournament community to brainstorm how to solve some of these problems. And hopefully there's some kind of conclusion that we can come to that alleviates most of this, so that it can become a fair tournament environment for all players involved. So if you want to continue the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.